It is a very good morning to you all and welcome to the Breakfast Club right here on Asake. My name is Fungai Mawada. Zimbabwe is headed for the 2023 elections, and a key factor that most people have been talking about is people with disabilities and their access to information as we head towards the elections. Joining me today in studio is Tsungi Tsikira, who is a projects officer at the Sign Language Interpreter Trust, which is found right here in Bulawayo, to talk more on this issue. Good morning, Tsungi, and welcome to the Breakfast Club.
Thank you, Fungai. Good morning.
All right, so maybe to begin with, tell us more about the Sign Language Interpreter Trust.
Okay, Sign Language Interpreter Trust is a not-for-profit organization that was formed with a mandate to bridge the communication gap between the deaf and the mainstream, that is the hearing people. So we realized that a lot of people, a lot of deaf people were not able to access information or services that are their rights because of the information gap, of the communication barriers. We are actually an interpreting agency. We have on-call interpreters whenever a deaf person needs to go to the hospital, to the courts, to educational settings or social settings. They can actually call us and we help them to access information in sign language or to interpreting services. So even stakeholders, the police, the courts, the nurses, doctors at the hospitals can call us and we assist with interpreting services.
All right, so what are the common misconceptions about sign language that you can demystify for us today?
Okay, the one that I can point out for now is the issue that the deaf people can write and read. Okay, so you go to the doctors or to a hospital or the clinic and the nurses will tell you, no, we can actually communicate with them, we write to them. But the actual truth is that a deaf person cannot read or write. The reason being with the formation of sign language and spoken language, the differences with the language formation. With a sign language is a visual language and a spoken language is formed totally different from sign language. So I'll give you an example to help you understand. You know, when we're in grade 0 or when children go to school, they are taught how to speak or to write an alphabet through the phonetic sounds. You hear them singing ba, 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 and then they are shown a picture of these sounds that follows that particular phonetic sound. And then you see an apple, ba, 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 they see a banana or something like that. So that's how a spoken language is formed. Now, for a deaf person, the sound is not getting to them. So when they see a bee, they cannot then connect ears with the banana or whatever. So another example that I can give you is for you, maybe you go to China and someone tries to speak to you in Chinese. Obviously, you don't understand Chinese, right? Then they say, no, this person, let's put them, maybe you are put in a glass proof, in a glass area with a soundproof. You cannot hear what they're saying. And they start talking to you from the other side and they try as loud as they can in Chinese. You will still not be able to understand. And they say, okay, let's exaggerate our mouth movements. Maybe they can lip read what we're saying in Chinese. They try harder. You still will not be able to do that. Mm-hmm. And then they'll say, okay, it's easier now. Let's write. And they put that, the Chinese way of writing, and they put it to you in that class. You still will not be able to get it. That's what happens with the deaf. So you try as much as you can to teach them in sign language, in English, or to say something or to write it in English. Most of the times, they will not be able to understand. So the preferred method of communication for most deaf people would be sign language because it's a visual language and it's formed differently. Okay. So that's the first misconception. So the other misconception that people have is that when a deaf person goes to them, maybe with a child, they can use that person as an interpreter. Well, that usually doesn't work well in a medical setup. Imagine a mother goes with their young boy child who is about 10 or 11, and they have to say something about their sexual reproductive health. And they have to tell the nurse that he had sex then on such a day, I'm having such problems on my genitalia. It's really difficult for a child to interpret such. So that's when we need to conscientize the public of the need for professional qualified sign language interpreters who are the bridging of the communication gap that exists between the deaf and the mainstream.
Okay, very interesting. And how many people actually speak sign language in Zimbabwe?
We can say roughly over 300,000. Unfortunately, there are no confirmed figures as such because I think it also comes to the nature of the disability. We always say that deafness is a hidden disability because you will not be able to see that this person is deaf when they are walking down the streets unless you try to talk to them. So that's what makes it difficult. And also, I read that recently the census that was conducted, we had about 7% of the population being disabled. But then you wonder, how do they then communicate with the deaf people? Because I didn't see any people who were moving around with an interpreter. So what happens is when you get to a place where there's a deaf person, obviously a hearing person would come and they will communicate with the person, the officer who was taking the census. So that person might not be recorded properly as a person with a disability.
Okay, so how is your organization working towards the inclusion of deaf people in society generally?
Okay, so as Sign Language Interpreter Trust, we offer a number of activities that we are running to help to bridge this gap and also to bring deaf awareness. The first thing is we are offering a course that we call a deaf awareness course to different stakeholders, students, as well as individuals who have an interest in sign language. So this course then teaches people about the deaf as a person, as a culture, the deaf culture, and also the deaf community. And also the basics, sign language, the ABCs, and the numbers, so that that person can then communicate with the deaf people. So that's the first thing. It's not really interpreting services for the deaf people as if it's only the deaf people who does want to understand what you're saying. We're also saying the stakeholders need to understand what the deaf people are saying, right? So the sign language interpreting is for everyone in general. So we offer such services to the community and to the society as a whole.
Okay, so then following your social media platforms, I saw something where you're talking about advocating for legal services for people who are deaf. How important is that, and what is your role in that particular role?
I think that's a very important thing. You know how complicated the legal system can be for anyone in general. And so it's actually difficult for a deaf person to access legal services because of the communication barrier. So I'll talk about what happened in October 2020. There's a ruling that came up in the Constitutional Court, I think, or High Court. I'm not too sure. I'll just check there. So the ruling was that you could not detain a deaf person with no interpreter when there's no interpreter. But when we go to the courts, I think right now we are working on 3 such cases where a deaf person has been detained. And the police took that person and they wrote a statement without an interpreter. Or there is no statement that's coming from the deaf person. They only have one statement from the other person who can speak. So you see, those are the violations. It also happens when the deaf person is the one who is the complainant. They need to tell the state what happened, and they go to the police there is no interpreter. Relatives, friends are the ones who are speaking on behalf of this person. So to really actually get the proper statement that can be used in the courts, it's difficult for the deaf person. So we are actually working with the legal system to try and help correct that and help the deaf person to access all the legal services. We are talking about birth registration, we're talking about maintenance issues for women and children, custody issues. We are working on.
All right. So, like I mentioned at the beginning, that we are headed towards the 2023 elections, and we're talking about inclusion here, where everyone has a right to vote at the end of the day. What are some of the challenges faced by deaf people in terms of access to information?
Okay, so I'm sure, like you have realized, it's a general thing that the information is not getting through to the deaf community as long as there is no sign language. So what happens is, with most information, it's put up in posters and flyers and written information, right? And like I have discussed, the deaf people cannot read that. So we need such information to be put in sign language for the deaf people to be able to understand. And also those campaigns that people are going around doing, or the voter education that has been running, it has also to have a sign language interpreter for the deaf people to understand. But then most of the people, like I said, deafness is a hidden disability. They'll say, we don't see the deaf, we don't know where to find them. So the issue starts with the mobilization. There's need to work with deaf organization or organizations that work with the deaf. Like we work with the deaf, we've got a database of people who are in that area where you are covering. Go to them and you if you come and you say we are working on this in this area, we need to mobilize the deaf. We can do that because when mobilization is being done, people will be speaking or there will be flyers. Still, the deaf might not be able to access that.
Yes. Okay. So how is your organization bridging that gap between the deaf and the hearing, so to speak, as well as are there people with disabilities who are also trying to campaign towards the 2023 elections or wanting to get into positions of political power within the deaf community?
Okay, so firstly, as an organization, we are providing interpreting services, right? We say we are the ear and the voice of the deaf. So whenever the deaf need to be heard, we are the voice. Whenever you need to say something to the deaf, we are the ear and then we interpret to them. So that's one way we are actually covering that gap. And then about deaf people being in positions that they want to vote, to qualify or to be voted into office, I haven't heard of any. Reason probably being they have no access to how they can do this. They probably don't even know how it can be done. Yeah, so maybe it all starts with the education of the deaf people. If you want to be voted into office, what do you need to do and how it is to be done?
Okay, so how can civic society as well as government help in alleviating some of these gaps?
So I think as we have discussed, we are realizing that the major issue is the information gap that exists because of the language barrier. So if you are a civic society organization or even government offices, you need to ask yourself this question. If a deaf person were to walk into our office right now, what's going to happen? Are they going to be able to, are we offering deaf-friendly services? Are they going to be able to communicate with us? So the ideal thing would be for a deaf person to walk into an organization and someone receives them with a smile and they can communicate with them in sign language just to say, hi, how are you? What is your name? And then have a sign language interpreter who can come in and take the rest of the conversation or whatever help that person wants. So it's important for one to at least have basics in sign language and also have interpreter agency contacts ready so that they can call a sign language interpreter and assist that deaf person further. And of course, we are saying that the problem will then become to people who say, we don't know where we can get interpreting services and maybe the budget. So it's important for an organization to also budget ahead of time for the services of a sign language interpreter. With other disabilities, it's easy now. You know, wherever you go, you're realizing that there are some ramps because they understand that for a person with a wheelchair to walk into their organization, there is need for that. So an equivalent to that for a deaf person would be a sign language interpreter.
Okay, and are you also advocating for the teaching of sign language in schools? I feel like maybe that's where the basis should be because, you know, for me, for example, I only encountered the use of sign language when I was watching TV and I'd watch the news and I'd be like, okay, there's a sign language interpreter there, but actually learning the language has never been like a push factor for me. So are you advocating perhaps for sign language to be taught within the grassroots as well?
Yes, I think that would be ideal, especially for the young ones who are in grade 0. They are very fast to take on languages. But then I think that applies to almost every other language in Zimbabwe, so that at least someone has a basic understanding of our local indigenous languages. I think that would be very nice, especially for the sign language. It would then mean inclusion for everyone. Just the understanding of a language would then take a person to another level of understanding the culture, because language obviously works with the culture, isn't it? So the culture of the deaf culture, which is a unique culture in its own, whether a person is born from a Shona family or a Ndebele family or a Tonga family, if they are deaf, they've got a culture that we call the deaf culture, which is so very different from all these other cultures. So when we're talking about mothers and bonding with their children, it all starts from birth, isn't it? And also when they go to the hospital for, what is it called? Antenatal clinic. So when they go to hospital for antenatal clinic. So we've often heard complaints from the deaf people who say that when they go to the hospital or to the clinic with their baby and they have someone with them, maybe with their helper, the nurses, they then focus on the helper. They tell the helper about their children. But as the mother, they need to know how they can raise their child properly, because they are the ones who will be with the child every day. So that's why it's very important for the medical health practitioners to understand everything about deafness, the deaf culture, and the deaf community as a whole, because then they can then best serve them in the proper way, starting with the mother who is a child who is not deaf, giving them services, telling them what to do, how to take care of their child, because then they will be more confident to raise their own children. And that bond that we're talking about will be there. And those children will then be able to sign. And sign language will then be accepted throughout the society. They can teach others.
All right, so September officially marks the celebrations of Global Deaf Awareness Month. What are you guys doing as an organization to commemorate or to celebrate this particular month?
So as an organization, this is a chance for us to actually spread the message wider, deaf awareness. People have to know that there are people, a community of deaf people who need to be served. And we are saying to stakeholders, to service providers, take this deaf awareness course, because this month, September 2022, is coming with a package of free interpreting services. So for you who take this course as an organization, we are then saying we are giving that organization interpreting services so that you see how best the deaf can be served, and the difference that it makes for a deaf person to be offered services that they actually understand and that they can actually to carry along. For example, if we are talking about the medical setup, if a doctor goes to raise a deaf patient and then they are using someone who is not an interpreter to understand what's the problem with the deaf person, and afterwards they are giving the medication. We have had so many cases where a deaf person will then don't even finish the course of the medication because they don't understand. Someone who is even on art will then say, now I'm feeling much better, I don't need to take medication anymore, because they don't understand their whole medical condition. But this month we are saying, use the services of a sign language interpreter and see what a difference it makes. It makes such a big difference, because that person can understand what their issue is. So, for example, we had an institution that maternal health care, maternal health and child care. It had a deaf patient who was pregnant. So when they first came to the organization, they struggled to communicate with them. The deaf person, of course, had our contacts and they called us in. We gave them interpreting services. But a question that came to the owner of the hospital, Sister Chamboko, is how then do I communicate to this person once the deaf interpreters are not there, once the interpreters are not there? So they came to us and they said, how best can we serve the deaf communication, the deaf community? That's when we said, no, you can have this deaf awareness course. They took the deaf awareness course, after which the whole institution can now at least use basic science to communicate with the deaf person. Afterwards, they are also using our interpreting services to better serve the community. So that's one thing that an institution can do. Take the deaf awareness course, get to know what the deaf community is, what deaf culture is, the basic sign language skills that will help you to at least interact with the deaf community, with the deaf person once they come to your organization.
Okay, very interesting. And I hope, a lot of stakeholders and organizations actually take this on board. Like you said so critically, that sign language is a language. So thank you so much, Tsungi Tsikira, for joining us in studio. And we wish you all the best with your organization and your future successes as well. And to you at home, thank you so much for joining us on the Breakfast Club. Like Tsungi highlighted, that sign language definitely is a language. And perhaps in future, we can see even areas of local governance, such as our city councils, our members of parliament, and everywhere where decision making is being made that we have sign language interpreters such that everyone is included in creating a lovely society for us here in Zimbabwe. But nonetheless, thank you so much for joining me on the Breakfast Club. Please make sure you join us again tomorrow, same time, right here on Asake. Don't forget to like and to follow us on all our social media platforms, right? Site ZW on Instagram, Facebook, as well as on Twitter. From myself and the team behind the scenes, goodbye.